You never forget the night your life changes. For me, it started with flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. My stomach tightened. I hadn't been speeding. I hadn't run a light. But I knew how this went. Black woman. Alone. Late at night. It didn't matter if I'd done nothing wrong. I pulled over to the side of the road, taking slow, deep breaths. Stay calm. Hands on the wheel. No sudden movements. I watched the officer in my side mirror as he approached. White, middle-aged, balding, with a face that carried the kind of arrogance only a man with unchecked power could wear. He tapped on my window. I rolled it down. License and registration. His tone was clipped and personal. I handed them over without a word. You know why I pulled you over. I shook my head. Broken taillight. I frowned. That didn't sound right. I kept my car in near-perfect condition. But I knew better than to argue. I wasn't aware of that, officer. He smirked, as if my response amused him. Step out of the vehicle. My pulse jumped. Excuse me. Step out of the vehicle. I hesitated, but then I saw it, the way his hand hovered near his holster. Not a direct threat, but a reminder. A warning. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out into the cool night air. He circled me like a predator sizing up its prey. Where you headed? Home. Where's home? Not far from here. He scoffed, looking me up and down. You been drinking? No. Drugs. I clenched my jaw. No. He exhaled dramatically, as if I was wasting his time. Then, before I could react, he grabbed my wrist and twisted it behind my back. Cold metal snapped around one wrist, then the other. Wait, what am I being arrested for? Resisting. I almost laughed. Resisting what? But the smirk on his face told me he wasn't interested in logic. He was enjoying this. I swallowed my rage and bit my tongue. Not here. Not now. Because I knew something he didn't. And tomorrow, when he walked into that courtroom, he'd find out exactly who I was. The ride to the station was silent. I sat in the back of the squad car, my wrists aching from the too tight cuffs, my pulse steady despite the situation. I knew better than to protest. I knew better than to ask questions. Anything I said would be twisted, used against me. The officer, his name tag read, Officer Randall, didn't look at me once as he drove, but I could see his smirk in the rearview mirror. He thought this was funny. Another night, another arrest, another black woman humiliated. He thought he owned this moment. I kept my face neutral, my breathing even. Let him have his little victory. For now. The station smelled like stale coffee and sweat. Randall shoved me toward the front desk, where a bored-looking officer barely glanced up from his computer. Another one, the desk officer muttered. Randall chuckled, resisting arrest. I stayed quiet. Let them think I was some random woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The desk officer motioned for Randall to take me to processing. He led me down a dim hallway, his grip still firm on my arm, though there was no need. I wasn't fighting. I wasn't giving him anything. We stopped at a holding cell. Randall unlocked the door and gestured inside with a mockingly polite wave of his hand. After you. I stepped in. The door clanged shut behind me. He leaned against the bars, arms crossed. That smirk was still there. What's wrong? Not so mouthy now, huh? I met his gaze, unblinking. His smirk widened. Yeah, that's what I thought. He turned and walked away, whistling. I sat down on the hard bench and let out a slow breath. My hands were free now, but the imprint of the cuffs still burned against my skin. I glanced at the clock. Almost midnight. A few more hours. Then morning would come. And Randall would walk into that courtroom, thinking this was just another routine case. He had no idea what was waiting for him. They released me just before dawn. No formal charges. No paperwork. Just an annoyed officer unlocking the cell and muttering, "You're free to go." Typical. They got what they wanted. Another long night, another attempt to break someone who looked like me. But I wasn't broken. I wasn't even rattled. I walked out of the station, my heels clicking against the pavement, and got into the black sedan that had been waiting for me. The driver nodded as I slid into the back seat. "Everything all right, ma'am?" I smiled. "It will be." Court convened at 9 a.m. sharp. I arrived early, as I always did. stepping into the grand marble-floored building with a presence that turned heads. My navy blue suit was crisp, my briefcase in hand, my posture unshaken. Inside, I could already hear the morning hum of the courtroom, clerks shuffling papers, attorneys whispering last-minute strategies, defendants shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Routine chaos. I took my place at the prosecutor's table, set down my files, and waited. Then the doors opened. Officer Randall walked in. At first, he didn't notice me. He was too busy laughing with another officer, walking with the same smug confidence he'd had the night before. He thought today would be just like any other day. Then his eyes landed on me. His grin faltered. His steps slowed. Confusion flickered across his face, followed by something else, unease. He squinted, as if trying to convince himself I wasn't real. I smiled. He looked at the judge, then back at me, his expression shifting from confusion to full-blown panic. I folded my hands neatly on the table. "Good morning, Officer Randall." His mouth opened, but no words came out. The judge entered. The bailiff called the court to order. And just like that, Randall's world started to crumble. He just didn't know how bad it was going to get. Randall looked like he wanted to disappear. His face had gone pale, his usual arrogance wiped clean. I could almost see the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out how the woman he'd handcuffed and shoved into a cell last night was now sitting at the prosecutor's table, calm, composed, in control. I didn't rush him. Let him sweat. Let him sit in that moment and feel it settle deep in his bones. The judge, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses, adjusted his papers and cleared his throat. "Let's proceed. First case on the docket. Officer Daniel Randall, charged with excessive force, unlawful detention, and falsifying a police report." Randall flinched. He turned sharply to the defense attorney beside him, a man who looked just as blindsided as he did. They whispered in frantic, hushed tones, but it didn't matter. Nothing they could say now would change what was about to happen. I stood, smoothing my jacket. My voice was even, professional. "Your Honor, we have surveillance footage from Officer Randall's patrol car, as well as traffic camera recordings, all of which contradict his report." I set a stack of documents on the judge's bench. "Additionally, we have evidence of a pattern, multiple complaints filed against this officer over the past 3 years. Every one of them dismissed before reaching court." The judge flipped through the pages. His brow furrowed. He glanced at Randall over his glasses. "Officer Randall, would you like to explain this?" Randall finally found his voice. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding." I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "A misunderstanding?" His jaw tightened. He had no answer. I turned back to the judge. "I also have an affidavit from last night's booking officer, confirming that I was detained without formal charges." I locked eyes with Randall. And of course, my own sworn testimony. The room was silent. Randall shifted in his seat. His attorney whispered something, but it didn't matter. He was done, and we both knew it. I leaned forward slightly, just enough for my words to reach him. "You thought last night was funny," I said, quiet enough that only he could hear. Still laughing. He said nothing. The judge exhaled sharply and turned to the defense attorney. "Counselor, I suggest your client start cooperating." Randall swallowed hard. The realization hit him all at once. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. But today, he wasn't the one in control. And for the first time, he knew it. Randall sat frozen, his fingers gripping the table, so tightly his knuckles went white. His mouth opened, then closed. His usual bravado had drained out of him completely, leaving behind a man who had just realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff with nowhere to go but down. The judge tapped his pen against the bench. "Officer Randall, I'll ask again, do you have anything to say for yourself?" His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Randall wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on me. Last night, he had looked at me like I was nothing, a minor inconvenience, a target. Now, he looked at me like I was his executioner. I let the silence stretch just long enough. Then I spoke. "Your Honor, the prosecution formally requests that Officer Randall be placed on immediate, unpaid suspension pending further investigation." I folded my hands neatly. Given his history, we believe he poses a liability to both the department and the public. Randall jolted. "You can't." The judge held up a hand, cutting him off. "You'll speak when spoken to, officer." The authority in his voice shut Randall up instantly. His jaw clenched. The room had turned on him, and he knew it. I pressed forward. "In addition, we intend to pursue charges for falsifying police reports and unlawful detention. The department's Internal Affairs Division has already been notified, and..." I slid another document across the table. "The Civil Rights Division of the DOJ has been made aware." Randall's lawyer snatched up the paper, his face draining of color as he skimmed through the contents. He turned to Randall. "We need to talk." Randall shook his head, still refusing to accept reality. "This is ridiculous." She was resisting. I arched a brow. Was I? His mouth opened, but he had nothing to say. Because he knew. And I knew. And now the court knew. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "Counsel, I suggest you and your client step outside and discuss how you want to proceed." He glanced at Randall over the rim of his glasses. "Because from where I'm sitting, this doesn't look good for you." Randall's lawyer grabbed his arm. "Now!" Randall stood stiffly, his movements robotic, his whole world cracking beneath him. As he followed his lawyer out of the courtroom, he turned back for one last look at me. I smiled. Not smugly, not cruelly, just a simple, knowing smile. Because justice doesn't always come swiftly. But when it does, some people never see it coming. Randall never came back into the courtroom. His lawyer returned alone, his expression tight, his suit suddenly looking too hot for him. He cleared his throat and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client has decided to resign from the force, effective immediately. We are also open to discussing a plea agreement." I sat back in my chair, completely unsurprised. Randall had spent years hiding behind his badge, believing it made him untouchable. But now, stripped of his uniform, with Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice breathing down his neck, he saw the truth. There was nowhere left to run. The judge nodded, unimpressed. "Noted. The court will reconvene in 2 weeks to determine the terms of his plea deal." He glanced at me. "Prosecution, I trust you'll provide the necessary documentation?" "Of course, Your Honor." He banged his gavel. Court adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the morning sun was bright, the air crisp. I stood at the top of the steps, watching as Randall slipped out the side exit, his head down, his shoulders hunched. No badge, no gun, no power. He must have felt me watching, because he stopped and turned. For the first time, he didn't look at me with arrogance, or amusement, or even anger. He looked at me with fear. Good. I walked past him without a word, stepping into the waiting black sedan. As the door shut behind me, I let out a slow breath, allowing the last 24 hours to finally settle. This wasn't just about me. It was about the people before me, the ones who had filed complaints that went nowhere, the ones who had been humiliated, detained, or worse, simply because Randall had the power to do it. Today, that power was gone, and justice, for once, had done what it was supposed to do. I smiled to myself as the car pulled away from the curb. Some people never see it coming. If this story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.